Hi, I'm Karen Minty, and sitting with me here today is world-class tenor drummer Tyler Fry. We're going to talk about drumming today. Thanks for being here with today, Tyler.
Thanks a lot for having me, Karen.
So, Tyler, how did you get your start in drumming?
Believe it or not, I never actually began in pipe bands as a tenor drummer. I actually began with a little bit of a bass drumming and snare drumming influence as well. I remember watching the Kincardine Scottish Pipe Band when I was about 2 or 3 years old, my hometown band. And what they do is they march up and down the main street every Saturday night in the summer, and thousands of tourists will actually flock behind them. I remember sitting on my dad's shoulders with my toy drum, and my grandma actually, you know those pom-poms on a Canadian toque, we call it those winter hats with the big ball on the end?
Yeah.
Well, what my grandma did was she tied a string to one of those pom-poms, and we would tie it to the end of my regular sort of toy drumsticks. And I sat on my dad's shoulders, flailing these things around, pretending to actually play with the band while we, followed them up the main street. So I was inspired by it, not by the tenor drummers, but believe it or not, the bass drummer during that time, the early 80s, actually flourished or twirled his sticks around as well. So I actually pretended I was a flourishing bass drummer back in, 80, 83, 84 on my dad's shoulders. So I wore the drum vertically as opposed to horizontally like a tenor drummer would. And it all, moved forward from there. The band was very good about inviting me in to play with them, and Duncan Campbell and Norm Dunsmore and all these other members of the bass section at the time were very, very good in terms of letting me jam with them in the park during those early years. So when I was 11 years old, I can recall with my good friend Reagan Jones, we saw an article in the paper talking about how the Kincardine Scottish Pipe Band would be offering drumming lessons. So I remember she and I showing up that night, and Jim MacArthur, my first snare drum teacher, he asked us what we wanted to get out of it. And I remember saying I wanted to be a tenor drummer, obviously being inspired by the flourishing from my past. So I remember being in the town hall and him telling me that, well, we're not actually looking for tenor drummers, we're looking for snare drummers. And back in those days, people weren't necessarily looking for tenor drummers. Their bands were even lucky to have a tenor drummer, let alone any tenor drummers, at least in Canada. So I showed up to the town hall, told them I wanted to be a tenor drummer, and he told me that they were looking for snare drummers, and that essentially I'd be learning snare drum. So that was cool because obviously it gave me a very strong technical and musical background in snare drumming. And Craig Cahoon, one of the world's best bass drummers in my opinion, actually came out to start teaching the snare drummers as well that very year, or actually a few months later after I started with Jim. So Reagan and I both, collectively or together, began snare drumming. And during that time, I was secretly watching tenor drummers or videos of tenor drummers, like Scott Railvale of Athol at Maxville in 1988, and Andy Miller and the Clan McFarlane during the early to mid 80s. These guys really inspired me. I was watching these guys flourish or twirl sticks around like nobody's business, and it was something that I still had a strong passion for wanting to do, despite at that time being a snare drummer. So I secretly taught myself tenor drumming, or at least how to flourish sticks around on the side while I was learning snare drum. In other words, the rhythmic side of the whole instrument. In Canada during that particular point in time, and in America as well to a large degree, guys who flourished or flourishing tenor drummers didn't typically hit the drum. All right, so what I was learning in snare drumming was typically independent of what the work I was doing visually on the side. In 1995, I had an opportunity to join a very famous, at least in Canada, juvenile band called the Milton Optimist Pipe Band. And they were out of Milton, Ontario. Just kind of, I guess, what's evolved to the suburbs of Toronto today. I actually began playing with Milton Optimist as a snare drummer and learning under Doug Stronach. And Doug Stronach taught me a ton about how to read and and how to rhythmic, to essentially develop rhythmically in ways that I'd never learned in the Kincardine band. So in 1995, I went off to play with the Milton Optimist again as a snare drummer. I remember speaking to Gail Brown, our pipe major at the time, who played in Shots back in the 70s. I remember Gail, saying she would never have a tenor drummer in her band. And I wasn't quite ready to make the snare line in my first contest with the band, or at least my first contest in Ontario. It was a medley. I remember it that year, 1995. It was a medley event in Georgetown of 1995. And I played snare drum solos that morning. But then I remember Craig Cahoon, my mentor from Kincardine, actually saying to Gail Brown, saying, you got to let this guy play tenor drum. And Gail was a little hesitant because she didn't want a tenor drummer in the band. But I need to backtrack a little bit, because a couple weeks prior at the American, or the United States Pipe Band Championships in Alma, Michigan, my good friends at the time, Graham and Blair Brown, actually said to me, Tyler, you're pretty good at twirling these sticks around. Why don't you go in the tenor drumming event? So I remember signing up for the event. I think back then there was only the professional or open class. So I signed up just for fun, played the contest, and somehow ended up winning the United States Tenor Drumming Championship in 1995. So I go back to Georgetown, where I couldn't quite make the snare line, and Gail Brown said to me, "How would you like to play tenor drum just for today?" And I did that. And I remember by mid-season, I think it would have been around July, or Chatham. Actually, it was Chatham. I was asked if I would play tenor drum in the 78 Fraser Highlanders, a top grade band, one of the top bands in Canada for the time. They'd won the World Championships in 1987. In my mind, these guys were at the top of their game, at least here in Ontario, or in my mind, growing up in Kincardine. They asked me to tenor drum with them, and I was like, yeah, okay, cool. So Craig Cahoon showed up to my house with a kilt and all that, and I remember playing Chatham with Milton Optimist as a snare drummer in grade 3, or kind of the middle of the pack grade. And I showed up immediately after playing the field with Milton Optimist. I remember showing up and playing, the rehearsal with the 78th on the day, and I remember a bunch of the pipers not being able to concentrate because there was this young boy flourishing all these sticks around, and it was a distraction for the bagpipers. So I was actually cut from my first contest that year in 1995, my potential contest as a tenor drummer in the 78th. I would say my sort of defining moment as a tenor drummer, at least where I sort of, in my mind, I officially became a tenor drummer, was when Milton Optimist kind of dissolved as a juvenile band at the end of that season, so in September of 1995. And I was invited to go with the 78 Fraser Highlanders to Vail, Colorado, and play with them as at that time, a flourishing tenor drummer. So I did that, and I don't know, in hindsight, it was kind of one of those crazy, it would be like playing at the World Cup, for soccer, and not knowing really what you're getting yourself into. But that was the very moment where playing the field and playing my first contest with the 78 Fraser Highlanders in September in Vail, Colorado, with all these beautiful mountains around me, was sort of the start to my official tenor drumming career. And I played with the 78 Fraser Highlanders as a tenor drummer for many years after that. I got all the way until the end of the 2003 season. I played with the 78. So that was a long time to stick with one band out of Toronto. But I had a lot of fun playing with Reagan Jones. Came as a tenor drummer. That young, that girl that I started snare drumming with, and more importantly, playing with Craig Cahoon, my second official snare drum teacher from my Kincardine roots, and playing with him as the bass drummer was certainly the greatest honor at that point in my life I could have ever achieved. And we had a lot of fun putting together, kind of, fusing all that knowledge from as a snare drummer and as a sort of an inspired bass drummer, fusing that knowledge together to see what we could come up with together to create sort of what we saw as the next direction for pipe band mid or bass sections.
That's quite impressive.
Yeah, well, believe it or not, this very park behind me here was the very park I grew up watching the Kincardine Scottish Pipe Band. When they'd finish their little parade up and down the main street, they'd always sort of culminate here in the bandstand right behind me right now. So I grew up watching, Junkie Campbell on the flourishing bass drum and Norm Dunsmore flourishing on his tenor drum right here in this very park as a young kid. And then as Kincardine Scottish Festival began to come underway in the early 2000s. This is where I used to compete with the 78 Fraser Highlanders in this very circle right now. And now I'm just judging the bass and tenor sections here as part of the games, or as part of this continued trial in North America right now. I would say typically that Scottish pipe bands play a huge role in Canadian society in general, or just more a reflection of our direct British or more, particularly Scottish roots. Kincardine, obviously being a Scottish settled community, had its first pipe band formed in 1909, and that's older than my band in Scotland, Shots and Dykehead, and it's certainly one of the oldest pipe bands in the world today. So I would say that there's certainly an icon or means of identity for many of these local communities in every town surrounding here in Bruce County. So it's pretty neat that every town here has a pipe band, just like every town in Scotland would have a pipe band.